Hello, and welcome to the Sauna Trail Book Club. This is Risto with the Sauna Trail, and I may be joined by some guests tonight. We've invited people to read our book, read along with us. I have a copy of it here. But before we get started with that, I want to kind of share a little bit of background for this book. We'll be breaking the book into 3 sections. So the book club will start tonight and then go each week on Tuesday and through November. So 4 weeks in total. Let me give you some of the background of this book. The Sauna Is by Bernhard Hillila was published in 1979. And sauna had, starting in the 50s and especially into the 60s, been experiencing tons of popularity in North America. So you can see here, this is a chart that shows when the term Finnish sauna was used in books in print. It really started to shoot up into the 50s and then into the 60s and 70s. The interest was kind of at the level that we're at today. They started adding saunas to gyms like the YMCA, hotels, boardrooms, and then the Amazon of that day, Sears, they would even sell sauna-related things. So it was super popular, and when sauna was first introduced to the North American market, the articles kind of look like this here. So you can see that it has like a family, and it's a separate structure, and wood burning, and community based, and it even had like Vitas. So it was like very much a Finnish cultural thing. But as time went along, it became more like this, which we've talked about in past episodes. They just started labeling anything that got you hot as a sauna or sauna. And so then a gentleman saw this happening, and his name is Bernhard Hillila, and he was uniquely situated to write a book about sauna to kind of correct some of the record. He was uniquely situated because he was Finnish American. He was an academic and an educator, so he knew several languages and he could do research. And he was a poet, so he could communicate well. And he was kind of a fun dude. He was also a slackliner way back in the day. So he, in the 70s, he decided to start researching, and he even took a trip to Finland, which he talks about in the first chapter. So I have a video where I'm reading through the first chapter of the book. And he had published this book through a small publisher in New York Mills, Minnesota. They're called Parta Printers. And then later it was republished a few times. Let's see, there's the first edition, which I highly recommend the first 2 editions. The illustrations were done by his wife. So there was a 79 and then a reprinting in 88. And then the final reprinting that I know of was in 2003. And the last 2 were published by a different publisher. And there's even a Kindle version. So if you want to catch up and join us, you can always get a hold of a digital copy real quick. And the chapters are really short and easy. Let me actually pull up the book. We'll take a look at it. This is the 1988 version. So tonight we'll be going through the first 3 chapters of the book. You can see right here, part of my heritage, a bath that's different, and a bathhouse with a history. So we'll be looking through those. So let's go ahead and just jump into the first part, a part of my heritage. This chapter kind of gives the reason for why he decided to write the book. He gives the purpose of the book and then also the background, kind of how he went about writing it. The purpose of the book that I got out of this chapter was he wanted to introduce people to sauna who weren't aware of the practice. Now, by this time in the late 70s, it was pretty much a household name in the United States. Probably most people knew about it, but in case they didn't, he wanted to be the first to give them a clear picture of what it was. But then also he wanted to correct the record. So as we go through this book, there's going to be a lot of him correcting the record. And then The other part of this chapter is discussing how he's going to do this. He's going to define what authentic sauna means to him and describe what that bathing experience is. And I'll be especially interested to see, it's been a while since I've read the book, to see how in depth he gets with the description. Because a lot of books, even though there's many books written about sauna, there's very few that actually kind of walk you through in detail what a Finnish American or Finnish sauna practice, what that's like. And then after he describes what that bathing experience is like, he's going to talk about the historical, physiological, psychological, and even moral issues. So it might get a little spicy. And then at the end of the book, provide some information about how to construct a sauna. So that's where most of the discussion and debate is these days online, is people arguing about whether you're constructing it right or not. But that's at the very end of his book. And then it's pretty much what I said. He wanted to correct misinformation, help people unlearn some of the things they had learned. And I've run into that a lot with sauna is you say the word sauna and most people kind of have an idea in their head of what that is, but it's going to be very different. Most Americans, their idea is very different than like what a Finnish American may have in mind. There's some commonalities. They're probably both thinking of a wooden room somewhere and it's going to be a hot room. And then maybe steam, but that's about where things start to deviate. And then chapter 2, the sauna is a bath that is different. So if you remember, if you go back to I'm going to go back to the table of contents. Just looking at the table of contents gives you kind of an idea of what he thinks about the sauna. So like heritage is the first chapter. Then bathhouse, history, Finns, bath. Then some of the others you might see in other books, but several of those he's kind of starting out very like bath and cultural heritage centric. Okay, so a bath that's different. This chapter is kind of explaining what sauna is at a high level. He starts with the word, with the pronunciation. Anytime you're learning something new about a different culture, or you try a new dish at a restaurant that has serves food from another country, one of the first things is you're asking what's the name, and you're trying to pronounce it correctly. So he gives the correct pronunciation there. And he describes sauna, he defines it at a high level as both a place and a practice. And the practice is the bathing part or a bath. The bath part is twofold. There's perspiring. That's kind of like cleansing from the inside. You're kind of sweating out all the gunk that you maybe had in you. And then washing. So then that's washing that off at the end. So there's kind of that two part. It's like a sweat bath and then just kind of a standard bath with like a bar of soap or a shower. And he kind of lays out the definition of sauna, and I kind of took away as like this would be a good basic definition of sauna, would be a Finnish bath that is accomplished through perspiring and washing. Obviously you have to unpack a lot of that. It's also leaving out a lot of the practice. But the question is like, what is the washing part like? And then how do you get to be perspiring? That's kind of the basics of what he has there. And then there's also a lot that's kind of bound up in the finish part of that. And then he mentions the hot air range of 160 Fahrenheit to 230. Although I don't think he loves sauna at those much higher temps. But he makes a good comparison. Like a lot of people think 212, your blood starts to boil. Isn't this going to be unsafe? But he does bring up a good picture of like when you have an oven set to 450 and then you reach inside the oven, it's not like your arm burns off right away. You're able to, the hot air is not too bad. You don't want to touch the metal, obviously, but you can have your arm in there for a little while. And then, of course, he mentions humidity, that the humidity is raised by splashing water on the rocks. But he makes special note to say that the humidity is not really raised that much. He objects to the use of the term steam bath because the relative humidity stays low. He prefers the term vapor bath. And that actually was a term, if you go look through old newspaper articles and documents, vapor bath is a term that you can find. And then he makes this distinction that the important part of sauna is the ability to regulate that humidity by splashing water on the rocks. So it's kind of he's getting into some more the more technical by saying like the air temperature is pretty high and the relative humidity is pretty low, but you can raise it just a little bit by splashing water on the rocks. And then he digs into a little bit and comparing it and contrasting it with Turkish hammam and Japanese onsen. And then he mentions that it's repeated sweating, washing, and deep cleansing and relaxation. So that's kind of, he's covered it in chapter 2, he's covered it at a high level. And then we get to chapter 3, a bathhouse with a history. So now he's going to start to go into, he told you what he's going to do in the book, chapter 1. He's defined sauna at a high level, chapter 2, which is very good. And then chapter 3, he's going to dig into kind of some of the more general history. And you can see a little bit of his academic side come out in this chapter. He's got a few little interesting nuggets. My high level summary of this chapter was different motivations and expressions of bath or bathing, and then the roots of sauna. He calls it a joyful bath, a bath that has ritual, kind of multifaceted. He uses the term perspiration bath. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Talks about ancient Roman baths, and in this underlined section here, that the Spartans would go between this hot, dry heat and a plunge in the water, which is you're starting to get kind of in the sauna territory, maybe without the steam. He mentions that some early church fathers had quotes about bathing, and the church sometimes would look on it positively, kind of the whole cleanliness next to godliness thing, but then also negatively in some terms, like it was more godly not to bathe a lot. So it's been looked at at different ways throughout history from the religious establishments. But in some societies, it was a part of society, and they had these large public baths. He even mentions that Roman bathhouses had lecture rooms, which I'm not sure you would do in a lecture room, maybe a book club. But that would be fascinating. It would be interesting to go back and visit one of those old baths. And that later in Europe, a lot of these bathhouses developed into a place of sexual activity, which he's going to address some of that in the later chapters. And then he does talk about Russian banya. And I don't know if I agree with Bernard on this one or not, but he says that it's more wet and is more like a steam bath. So I'm always hearing conflicting things on these. Either Banya is hotter or it's less hot or it's more steamy, less steamy. I don't know. I think there's a lot of expressions of Russian Banya and Finnish sauna, and there's quite a bit of overlap. He also mentions hot springs and Native American tents, and that it's a good place to clear your mind and feel better. In fact, he mentions a story about Native Americans, a story where they were talking about going to the sweat lodge after the death of a wife, a spouse, and that it made them feel much better. So, as you can see, the chapters are pretty short. I think this third one was the longest, but it's not too bad. There's the story about the sweat lodge. And so he's covered what he's going to do in the book, uh, kind of just a general overview. Very good chapter on defining sauna. So I'd highly recommend checking out this chapter if you're like, what is sauna? And then the history. And then in the next chapters, he's going to dig more into the actual finished practice. So if you take a look at the contents here, next week's book club, we'll be discussing, whoever wants to join, either I'll be discussing, going through my notes and sharing them with you, or if you guys want to come on, you can read, and if you have any notes you want to share with the rest of us, kind of share your thoughts and ideas, you're welcome to do that. So the next 3 chapters are a gift from the Finns, a bath that is enjoyable, and a means of rejuvenation. So he's going to start getting into some of the more details and specifics. And you can see, I meant to say this earlier, just how like small this book is. It's a very easy read. It's one of the smallest sauna books I have, but I also think it's one of the most important because of how much went into it. Anyone knows that if you try and create like a short definition that's comprehensive, that's a difficult thing to do. So here's the breakdown of the 4 weeks of the book club and the next 3 weeks there. You can see on November 11th, I'll cover those three things, and maybe I'll have Julie join me or one of the kids. And then November 18th, spot for relaxation, a setting for propriety. I mentioned he's going to talk about the sexualization of the bathhouse, an aid for grooming. And then on November 25th, room for heating, a project for do-it-yourselfers, and a variety of designs. So that's going to be kind of construction focused, which isn't the main focus of the book, but it'd still be interesting to see what's said there. So I think that's the end of my notes and my presentation. I recommend if you get a copy that you get one of the 79 or 88 if you can track down a used copy of those. The reason I say that is because the artwork is more of that original artwork and it's less kind of comedically focused. He did write another book that was very comedic. I think it's called Fin Fun. And they've kind of, the publisher decided to take that theme and move it over to the sauna book. But the sauna book's not very funny, even though he does, you do pick up he has a good sense of humor, but it's actually a rather serious book. So that's why I like those first two versions better. And then if you want to get anyone just a great starter book on sauna, I highly recommend this book. It's just a good introduction if someone wants to understand it. Thanks for joining me on the stream tonight, and I hope you get a chance to read the book, and I hope we get a chance to speak with some of you next week. I hope you have a good evening. Enjoy the cold weather if you're in a northern climate. Good night.